Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. It's a real pleasure to see you here this evening. As we think about the exciting events of the last couple of weeks in Grand Rapids, I hope that you all partook not only of the art all over the city, but of the art here at the Ford Museum. We were very honored to display 7 works of art and also to host a lecture by Michael Kaiser, the director of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington. We are already eagerly planning for next year, and I hope that you are too, because I think it was a phenomenal event for all of Michigan, but especially Grand Rapids and West Michigan. Tonight's program is part of a new chapter in the educational programming of the Ford Presidential Library and Museum, as we are hosting another lecture featuring the winner of the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency. This award has been given annually for 21 years at a June event at the National Press Club in Washington. While the stipend for the award is funded by the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, it's important to note that the selection of the winner is made by an independent panel of national journalists and university faculty, and that is chaired by Jim Cannon. With us tonight representing the Ford Foundation, which funds the award, is Joe Calvaruso, the executive director, and also his wife Donna. And Joe is right there. In addition to the award for reporting on the presidency, there is also an award for distinguished reporting on national defense. And the 2008 winner of that award is James Kitfield of the National Journal. And he will be speaking at the library in Ann Arbor in November. So I hope that you will think about coming to Ann Arbor for that lecture as well. In winning the 2008 prize for reporting on the presidency, Kenneth Walsh, who is from U.S. News and World Report, joins the distinguished company of prior winners, including Charlie Baker of the New York Times, Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, Michael Isikoff of Newsweek, Michael Duffy of Time, and Jackie Calmes from the Wall Street Journal. That's pretty impressive company. To introduce our speaker this evening, it's a pleasure for me to welcome Barbara McGregor, my colleague, who is the museum's education specialist, who supported the work of the selection committee again this year. Barbara?
Thanks, Elaine. It's my pleasure to add my welcome to all of you tonight, to Elaine's, and as she mentioned, to introduce this evening's speaker. I first had the opportunity to become acquainted with Ken Walsh last spring, as Elaine mentioned, when I was assisting the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation with the Journalism Prize awards. Ken's was one of the entries submitted for reporting on the presidency and turned over to our esteemed panel of judges. Not long after that, I was notified that Ken was the 2009 winner for reporting in 2008. Then I had the good fortune of being the one to notify Ken of his selection. That's the fun part of the job. The awards are presented by Jack Ford, chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, and of course son of President and Mrs. Ford, at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. I would like to share the judge's citation with you, as I think it will not only give you insight into Ken's research and reporting skills, but also what the judges look for in winning entries. Examining the final year of the presidency of George W. Bush, Kenneth T. Walsh portrayed the 43rd president, his record, his policies, his actions, his successes and disappointments, and his character with insight, perspective, fairness, and objectivity. Basing his work on extensive research, Walsh combined judgments from historians, interviews of close family members, and reportorial skills to offer depth of understanding of this presidency. He told his readers not only how, but why President Bush II dealt with the appalling tragedy of 9/11, the misinformation that provoked a preventive war in Iraq, and the economic downturn that marked the end of his 8 years in office. By resourcefulness in reporting and clarity of writing, Walsh has recorded a commendable account of the legacy of George W. Bush. In addition to being the now 3-time recipient of this prize in its 21 years, Ken has received numerous other awards and recognitions for both his reporting and teaching. His background and experience in journalism and writing is extensive. He is one of the longest-serving reporters ever to cover the presidency, Though, Ken, I'm pretty sure Helen Thomas has you beat. You've got a few years to go there. This, combined with his extensive contact list of Washington insiders, gives Ken historical and contemporary perspectives on current events. After receiving his bachelor's degree in journalism from Rutgers University and master's degree in communication from American University, Ken spent 2 years as a lieutenant in the Army before beginning his career in reporting. His first job in journalism was in Denver as the Associated Press Denver-based reporter. He then served as political reporter, columnist, and Washington correspondent for the Denver Post from 1976 to 1984. It was in his reporting days in Denver that Ken first met and interviewed President Ford. He joined the staff of U.S. News and World Report in 1984. Since 1986, Ken has covered the presidency, presidential campaigns, and national politics for the magazine, traveling to over 60 countries while doing so. In addition to his work as Chief White House Correspondent for U.S. News and World Report, Ken is a frequent lecturer around the country, although as we were talking over dinner, with the economy the way it is, less and less of that these days. On November 4th, he will moderate his 4th panel discussion at the Smithsonian, this one exploring President Obama's first 365 days. Ken regularly appears on major television networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, Fox News Channel, and on, in addition to radio, including NPR, and numerous syndicated and satellite radio talk shows. Ken serves on the board and is past president of the White House Correspondents Association. He has been an adjunct professor at American University in Washington, D.C., teaching such classes as the President and the Media and Media Ethics, and he has twice served as judge for the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Awards. And if that isn't enough, Ken is the author of 4 books: From Mount Vernon to Crawford, A History of the Presidents and Their Retreats; Air Force One, A History of the Presidents, and Their Planes; Ronald Reagan, and Feeding the Beast, The White House versus the Press. Ken is currently working on his 5th book, Blacks in the White House, From Slavery Through the President, and in fact will be traveling to Ann Arbor tomorrow to the Gerald Ford Library to spend 2 days conducting research for this new book. Historian and author Douglas Brinkley says of Ken Walsh, "No journalist today covers U.S. presidential politics with the same bedrock self-assurance, analytical thought, and literary aplomb as Ken Walsh." Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Ken Walsh.
Well, thank you very much, and I think our curtain is supposed to open here momentarily, but I wanted to just start out by saying I am an old school reporter, so I hope by the end of my remarks you don't know what my politics are. I've covered the White House since 1986. I've covered 5 presidents, and I think part of the reason I've been able to do that for so long is because the people I cover don't know what my politics are. The only people who know are my family, my wife, my parents, and my children. And they're not going to tell. So lots of times I get questions about, did I vote for this president or that president or whatever? But my answer is always, one reason I've been able to do this for so long is that my politics are something that people don't know, and I think that's the way it should be. I wish more of my colleagues in journalism did things that way, frankly, but that's less and less true. I wanted to start out by also thanking the judges and the Ford organization for the Ford Prize. We consider it in Washington sort of the Oscars of presidential journalism, and it's a wonderful prize, and I'm just really privileged to have won it 3 times now. I am going to talk about President Obama. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of his election, which is November 4th, so it's a particularly good time for us to be talking about this, and there's going to be a lot of coverage of this, a lot of focus on it. So I think that sound means that the slides are about to begin. There we go. By the way, can you all hear me okay? Great. What I wanted to do is to start out just with a little context on the election and how we've sort of gotten to where we are now with President Obama. When I started giving talks like this a couple of years ago, my point was that change was in the air. Americans seemed to want something much different than they were getting from Washington, not only President Bush, but from Congress and from the political establishment at the time. So at one point during the campaign, and you remember those debates, there were 19 presidential candidates at one point, and for each side they couldn't find platforms wide enough to accept all the candidates during the debates. You remember how they went. But at one point we were going to possibly have the first woman president, the first Mormon president, the first Latino president, and the first African American president. All that was possible. And of course what happened was America did choose the first African American president that we've ever had. This is President Obama on election night in Chicago when he gave his victory address. And it was quite a jubilant situation in Chicago. Just to give you a sense of that crowd there in Grant Park, just look at the size of the crowd. It was about 250,000 people that jammed into Grant Park, and it was an incredibly diverse group of race and gender and age and so on. But there was a sense that change had arrived and that America had broken through this racial barrier, that President Obama, his election had shown that America was perhaps headed for a post-racial period. Now, I'll let you judge whether we've gotten there or not. There's a lot of things that indicate that we have, but a lot of things indicate that we haven't. But at that moment on election night, there was a real sense that something really important had happened in the country, and a lot of people were very proud that Americans had elected Barack Obama as the first, as I say, African-American president. Now, he's, of course, much different than any president we've had before, not only in terms of race, but a lot of his background. He's the son of a white woman from Kansas and a black man from Kenya. He was raised for much of his early life in Indonesia and in Hawaii. And he was not defining the racial issue for America in terms of slavery and segregation, but in terms of immigration and sort of moving beyond the debates of the past. So it was a very important kind of debate we had in the campaign. I just wanted to show you a little bit, refresh your memory a little bit about what happened in the election. This is the famous electoral map with the red states and the blue states. At this point, a year ago, Barack Obama was moving ahead of Senator McCain, who was the Republican nominee, and this is the way it turned out. If you look carefully at the map, you know, these red states were the Republican states and the blue states are the Democratic states. No particular magic to those colors. The television networks just invented them because they were vivid. They have no broader meaning. But if you look at the states that Obama carried, he carried a number of states that Republicans generally win. He wins North Carolina, Virginia. He wins Indiana, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada. So he's built an interesting, different kind of coalition here, state by state. You can also notice he wins Ohio and Florida, which are the swing states that tend to determine our elections every 4 years, cycle after cycle. So he does very well in that context. He wins a clear majority of the popular vote. When President Clinton ran for president and won twice, he never got a majority. So this was another sort of achievement of President Obama, winning this electoral and popular majority. Now, this is election night, just an illustration of the first family. Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, their daughters, Sasha and Malia. Now, one interesting thing about this is that this is a young family. And so lots of times when I give talks like this, people always ask me, what difference does that make? Well, raising young children in the White House is a very difficult thing. You can imagine, you know, when President Obama wants to take his daughters out for ice cream, he's got to get into a motorcade with them. There are Secret Service agents armed with semi-automatic weapons in SUVs with tinted windows. There are staff members that go along. It's a huge production, so you wonder how children like this can have any kind of a normal life in the White House. And that's one challenge that the Obamas face personally as a family. But Americans like the idea of a young family in the White House. There's a number of polls about that are reflective of that notion. Now, I get back to Barack Obama's background. We never have had a picture like this of a president before. This is a fun picture. It's just sort of a light moment, but this sort of President Obama is a surfer. And he was raised, as I said, in Hawaii for a number of years, and there's something they call the aloha spirit in Hawaii. People who are from very diverse cultures, from the Pacific Rim, from Asia, have collected on the Hawaiian Islands. And so I went out to Hawaii, fortunately for me, a great reporting trip, as you might imagine, to look into his background. And people kept bringing up this idea that we're on this island together, there's no place else for us to go, so we've got to get along with each other. So that's part of the aloha spirit, the notion that people of different backgrounds and diversity have to get along, and their leaders can't divide them, they've got to sort of bring them together. Of course, that's being tested in Washington today. But sort of as a side note, whenever a president is elected, and this is my 5th president that I've covered, we always wonder, where is the president going to go on vacation? Those of us in the press corps who will accompany the president. So if the choice is between Chicago and Hawaii, well, I think you can figure out where we'd rather go. Nothing against Chicago, but I think the lure of Hawaii is much more intense, particularly over like Christmas holidays. But of course, what did Obama do in the summer? He didn't go to either Chicago or Hawaii. He went to Martha's Vineyard for his vacation, so he sort of threw us off with that. But we're still hoping that Hawaii comes back in another guise. One other little personal moment, sort of another light moment. Presidents, when they relax, often play golf. They do things that might relax them, or maybe jog, more of a solitary pursuit. One interesting thing about Obama is that he is a basketball player. So this has caused a lot of speculation as to what this means. And we dissect everything in the media these days. So the question is, it's a team sport. Does this mean he's going to play more of a team? Is he going to reach out to people more? You know, if somebody's hogging the ball and isn't shooting well, is he going to sort of insist that they pass the ball around to other people? Also, basketball, in the way Obama was brought up to play it, was sort of an urban sport. So he's the first real urban president, real city president that we've had, in addition to his Hawaii background. So it's a very interesting collection of different parts of his background that we have here. Who can we compare President Obama to? And I'll get to the substance of policy in a moment. But when he came into office, there was a lot of speculation that he was going to see himself and perhaps model himself on another president from Illinois, which was Abraham Lincoln. Obama did start to do that. He talked about how Lincoln was a state legislator in Illinois, as he had been. He had served in the Congress, in the House of Representatives for a short time. Obama had served in the Senate for a short time. Neither of them were expected to win the presidency. They sort of came out of nowhere. And of course, the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation really resonated with Barack Obama as an African American. So he had a lot of sort of bonding he did in reading his history and comparing himself to Lincoln. You might recall that when he started his presidency, he made a trip tracing Lincoln's path to Washington after he was elected, and Barack Obama made a lot of that same trip to Washington. Now, as time has gone on, I think we've seen that there's some Lincoln comparisons, but there's other presidents that there are comparisons to also. Now, of course, President Kennedy. I mentioned how there's a young family in the White House. President Kennedy had a young family in the White House. We remember those pictures of little John Jr. under the desk, and Caroline dancing and doing little acrobatics for her dad in the Oval Office. President Obama has his 2 daughters, and so there's a sense of a young family, but also the sense of vigor and energy that President Kennedy brought to the White House that President Obama is encouraging as a comparison. President Kennedy talked about passing the torch to a new generation. There's a lot of that in what President Obama talked about in the campaign, that he's a young man. He still talks about this, that he's a young man, relatively speaking, both Kennedy and Obama being in their 40s when they took office, and Obama talks about, as Kennedy did, moving beyond the debates of the past, in Obama's case, moving beyond the wedge issues, the divisive issues, Vietnam, crime, abortion, and try to define things differently and to put new issues on the plate for the American public. And that is, I think there's some valid comparisons there. Again, I'll leave you to judge how valid they are, but certainly there are some comparisons we could make to Kennedy here in the first year of Barack Obama's presidency. But I think the most valid comparison is with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, took office during two of the worst calamities we've ever had facing the world, really, the Great Depression and World War II. And so President Obama takes office with not as bad calamities as Roosevelt had, but a similar parallel here, sort of another sort of bookend to the Roosevelt presidency. Roosevelt had to deal with fascism. This is Hitler addressing a rally. There was the threat of fascism on the march in Germany and in Japan at the time, the threats to the international democracy system that Roosevelt helped lead the world to win World War II. There was also the terrible problems of the Depression. This picture is very evocative for me. It shows some of you, I'm sure none of you are old enough to have experienced this personally, but basically this is a food line or a bread line from the Depression. At that time, because you look at the faces of these fellows here, just look at how desperate and poignant this is. At that time, it was considered humiliating and embarrassing and even dishonorable to be out of work and to take welfare or to take help. A lot of people felt that was that you should be able to take care of yourself. So when the Depression hit and unemployment reached, for much of the Depression, 25%, in other words, 1 out of every 4 Americans could not find work. For a while it was about 33%. 1 out of every 3 Americans could not find work, and there was no safety net. At that point, there was really not many places for people to turn except private charities and churches and so on. But what Roosevelt did, he didn't end the Depression. There's a lot of history still being debated about this. He didn't end the Depression, but what he did is he created a safety net for people so the government would take care of people in their most desperate times. Social Security, unemployment insurance, public works jobs. There's a lot of controversy about those issues today, but one reason that I think Franklin Roosevelt was beloved by most Americans, and he really was, is because not that he ended the Depression, but he created the safety net for people in their desperation. And people never forgot that and always admired Roosevelt. For many, many years after that, there was this Roosevelt coalition that was very important. So now let's compare where we are today with Roosevelt and Barack Obama. Well, we have 2 wars going on now, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. The war in Iraq, President Obama is winding down. The government there, he feels, and as President Bush did at the end of his presidency, pull out our combat troops in 19 months of his and 16 months after his election. It's now at 19 months. But he's still holding to that timetable. Afghanistan is the opposite. He's escalating. He's already committed 21,000 more troops to Afghanistan. By the end of the year, we should have 68,000 troops there, with the NATO forces that have put up more than 100,000 allied troops there. And now there's a tremendous debate in Washington over whether we should escalate further. You might have followed this General Stanley McChrystal, who's the commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, who has this very controversial report calling for another 40,000 troops. And McChrystal made a public speech about this in London and said if we don't have the troops, we're going to lose the war. And a lot of people felt he was talking out of school, and this should have been done through the chain of command. It should not have been done publicly. That's another debate that's going on in Washington, whether McChrystal was wise to do that. I think it's evident that McChrystal feels a bit chastened because the White House has sort of slapped his wrist in a minimal way, and he has not talked publicly since then. I think that's a sign that he's gotten the message. But nevertheless, President Obama has a tremendous decision to make here on what he's going to do, particularly in Afghanistan. This idea of defining moments is often overused, but this could be a legitimate defining moment for President Obama, because a lot of people think of Afghanistan now in terms of where President Kennedy was with Vietnam in the early stages. I was just reading about this again the other day, and how Kennedy told Arthur Schlesinger, one of his advisors, a famous historian, you know, if we keep putting these troops in, the military will ask for more troops today, but then next year they'll ask for more. Then they'll ask for more after that. Where does it end? So there's some evidence that Kennedy might not have escalated, but he, of course, was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson did escalate. So, again, I'll leave it for you to decide whether there's a comparison to Vietnam. There are many differences, some similarities, but in Washington there's a lot of debate now that perhaps Vietnam is a valid comparison. But President Obama is very meticulously and methodically going through all the options. One thing I think we've learned about him, which I'll come back to in a moment, is he is a very methodical and careful decision maker. Today he had still another meeting with his national security advisors, which was expected to go on for about 3 hours. This will be his 4th meeting on Afghanistan in the last few weeks. He's in no hurry to make this decision, even though some of his critics say he needs to make it much more quickly than he is. I think he recognizes, and a lot of people recognize, this is a fundamental choice he's going to make. And there's a lot of choices to make, not only the 40,000 troop escalation, but defining a strategy that does not call for occupying Afghanistan, but calls for a much less of a troop presence, and perhaps dealing with Afghanistan through covert operations, through bombing, drones, and training the Afghan military, so that American soldiers are not on the front lines as much as they have been. Of course, we still have the problem of terrorism. Getting back to that international theme, bin Laden is still on the loose. He's, of course, the terrorist who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and that plane that went down in Pennsylvania that might well have been headed to the Capitol or the White House. Still on the loose more than 8 years later. Now, would it really matter if we caught him? Well, it would be a tremendous symbolic success, but you don't hear nearly as much about the war on terrorism, as President Bush used to call it, as you used to. Obama feels that it's better to keep that less of a focus publicly and to just conduct it so that it's not judged day to day as a success or failure, that it's a long-term proposition, and so we don't need to call attention to it every day. Just let it happen, let it operate as it is largely in secrecy, and if there's something good to talk about, then he'll do that. But that's still going on, but in a much different fashion than President Bush waged the war on terrorism. Domestically, this is an oil rig. Of course, energy is a big problem we have in the United States. Obama is trying to address that. It's probably going to come up later this year or next year, this whole notion of what do we do about fossil fuels. You've heard presidents talk about this for many, many years now. We're overly reliant on oil from the Middle East, from countries that want to do us harm, from countries that don't like us very much. We're susceptible to enormous price swings, to shortages. So why do we keep this going? Why do we remain so dependent on foreign oil? So the answer is multivaried. More energy development in the United States. Some people want more nuclear development. President Obama is not wild about that idea, but he's committed to this idea of reducing carbon emissions. This cap and trade theme that you might have heard about, which involves companies having limits on the carbon emissions which cause global warming, and they can trade and buy permits for these emissions. A very controversial thing, because I don't think there's any doubt that people's consumer bills will go up if this happens. But this is a big issue that's probably for the future. It's something that he's going to address most particularly next year. That unemployment issue, I think, is the most important part of the economic problems we have today, politically and in people's lives. You get it in polling, you get it in anecdotal evidence. People are worried about their jobs, their families' jobs, their children's jobs. This unemployment rate that keeps going up. It has gone from, it's now 9.8%. Everybody in the economics world seems to think it's going to go up to over 10% shortly, much less than what Roosevelt had to deal with, but something that Americans are very worried about. So I think if I have to say there's one single economic problem people are worried about, it's the unemployment rate. And that's a lagging indicator. In other words, the regular general economy could do a lot better, and unemployment takes a long time to recover from a recession. Now, Obama also had, and it's interesting that as his time in office began, he didn't get a breather from these crises. It's not often that a president has to deal with crises from day one, across the board. Remember, we had a financial system that was collapsing. President Bush had to deal with that, of course, and he started us on the road to this vast stimulus spending. President Obama has continued that and multiplied it. He got a $787 billion stimulus program passed. Hasn't done much for unemployment, hasn't done much of anything for unemployment, but it has apparently gotten the states more solvent. By the way, it's interesting, we were talking about this earlier, that if the national unemployment rate is about 10%, what happens in a state like Michigan? I understand your unemployment rate is 15 and above. And in some places, it's much worse. So you're probably dealing with depression levels of unemployment in many areas of the country, including the Midwest. And that's a very serious problem. And it's going to cause, I think, more social unrest as time goes on. But the White House is very well aware of this, but there's no clear solution to it. But in any case, just to get back to that notion of Obama takes office, he's got these international crises, 2 wars. He's got the financial system melting down. He has to deal with his mortgage crisis, people losing their homes because lots of times they were taking risks they shouldn't have been taking. But nevertheless, you had thousands, hundreds of thousands of people losing their homes, having payments they couldn't make. Unemployment rate hitting the highest rate now in 25, 26 years. So, and he doesn't get a breather from it. You know, we tend to forget some things. Some people think that just one of these crises would be enough to fill up the plate of a president. He's got to deal with all of these things. And I happen to have interviewed President Obama about a week or so ago for a cover story I wrote that's coming out next week on President Obama as a crisis leader. And I said to him, you didn't have any executive experience. You didn't have any experience dealing with these kind of crises. How do you do it? What prepared you for this? And he sort of laughed and he said, well, nothing prepares you for the presidency. That's one thing I've learned, that no matter what you've done in your life, you don't realize the velocity of decisions you have to make, and you have to rely on your judgment and the people around you. So it's very important to have talented staff and so on. But it comes down to the judgment of the president, and it's very difficult to see what kind of experience best prepares you for that. Especially in a situation like Obama faced, where he had to deal with these many crises from the beginning of his time in office. Now, health care, this is an emergency room, of course. This is the issue that's been on the front burner in Washington now these many weeks. The Senate Finance Committee yesterday passed a version of this health care overhaul. Now you have the Senate working on that, trying to combine it with other bills. The House has passed 5 bills. So everything has to be combined if they're going to get a health care proposal through this year. But it's another tremendous challenge. You know, talk about putting things on your plate. I mean, is this too much to ask that the Congress and the country can take all these big decisions and big issues and big changes? In addition to health care, Obama is trying to insert the federal government into more and more things, as Roosevelt did. Federal activism is increasing, and Obama feels that that's what the country wants. We will see how that turns out. A lot of people are worried the government is getting too involved in the economy and in the country, that our national debt is increasing at an astronomical rate, and that people are getting very worried about this. But on health care, Obama's argument is we've been trying to fix health care from Roosevelt's time. Harry Truman tried it. Just about every president tries to make the system more affordable, restrain costs, get closer to universal coverage. and now he feels that it's within reach, at least a fundamental change is within reach, not all the objectives he set out with. So we'll see how that plays out, but in the next few weeks, in addition to dealing with Afghanistan, he's got to deal with the health care issue because it's coming to a head. It's got to be decided by the end of the year, and a lot of people feel if it's not, it's not going to pass. So you're going to see President Obama focus on this very, very intently, in addition to Afghanistan, in the next few weeks. Now, this is I brought a couple of illustrations of where we are. This is the national debt from 1940 to today. You can see why people are so worried about this. You know, it's not, it's almost negligible in 1940, although people made a big deal that Roosevelt was spending too much money. It remained rather steady for a number of years. Then it started to go up. And now, this chart I made up a few weeks ago goes up to $9 trillion. If I made it up today, it would go up through the ceiling. It's up now over $11 trillion, approaching $12 trillion, based on projections. So whenever I give talks like this, people ask me, well, what are we going to do about this? Who's going to pay for all this debt? Well, we all are. There's only two ways to deal with the debt. We cut spending or we raise taxes. It's very difficult for people in Washington to cut spending. So at some point, there's going to have to be some kind of revenue raise, and that's sort of code word for tax increases. When I give this talk to young people, they're especially gasping, thinking that they're going to have to pay for this when they grow up. But that's the way we're headed. It's a tremendous amount of debt, and this kind of chart is what scares a lot of people. You know, we hear this in abstract terms. If you see it in terms of this chart, you can see how vast, it's almost incomprehensible how much our debt has increased. And it keeps going up all the time. Another illustration of our economic problem. This is an illustration of the entitlement programs. That is Social Security, of course, for the elderly, Medicaid, medical care for the poor, and Medicare, medical care for the elderly. Now look at these. This is another sign. The entitlements, of course, are programs people are entitled to by law. The law has to be changed for that program to be limited. It's very difficult to do that because, particularly for the elderly, it's a very important political constituency that does not like the idea of having their benefits cut. And we can understand that. You know, seniors have a very difficult time sometimes. It's difficult for them to have income if their nest eggs have dissolved and so on. So there's a lot of sympathy to the elderly, but these programs are going up. It's almost 25% of our gross domestic product now, which is a huge portion of our economy that goes to these three programs. So you can see the kind of path we're on, the kind of challenges that any president will face in the near future on the economy alone. Now, when Obama came into office, I want to talk a little bit about the people around him. He talked about doing things differently, having new blood, fresh faces, new ideas in Washington. Well, it hasn't quite turned out that way. He has brought in a lot of veteran Washington insiders. This, of course, is Rahm Emanuel, who was an advisor to Bill Clinton in Clinton's White House, became a congressman from Illinois, and is now White House Chief of Staff. Sort of a consummate Washington insider, and is really at Obama's elbow all the time. Emanuel came up with this notion, excuse me, some months ago, that we can't let a good crisis go to waste. That if there's a crisis, we have to act on it because that's when people will tolerate what in his mind was a lot more government activism. And that's really where we are. This government activism is on a tremendously accelerated pace now. I'm one to think that we tend to go through these pendulum swings in our politics. People want more government activism than they want less. You know, Reagan was sort of the height of the notion of cutting back the government. Then it started to swing the other way. Now President Obama is swinging it very aggressively toward more government activism. And that's, as I said earlier, worrying a lot of people. Another insider, we all know who this is, Hillary Clinton. It's interesting because it goes back a little bit to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln assembled what the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin called a team of rivals, which is the name of her book. The people who had been opponents of Lincoln politically, he brought into his cabinet to keep them at his side and to give him different ideas about what he should do as president. Hillary Clinton, when I said earlier that we could have had the first woman president, it would have been Hillary Clinton. She was thought to be the leader. She was thought to be not only the prohibitive favorite for the Democratic nomination, but the favorite for winning the presidency, and Obama defeated her for the nomination, of course went on to be president. It was quite a bitter campaign with Hillary Clinton, but what happened was Obama decided to emulate Lincoln and bring his chief rival into his administration as Secretary of State. So she is our chief diplomat, and by all indications is become a very loyal advisor to President Obama. Now there's another part of this, there's another person in this picture that you might notice. It's Bill Clinton, sort of our president for 8 years. So the question is, what does a president do with the former presidents, especially when the Secretary of State is married to a former president? Now Bill Clinton has ideas of his own about what policy should be. During the campaign he was very critical of Barack Obama. It took him a long time to get over the idea that his wife was not going to follow him into the White House. So the question is, how much is Bill Clinton going to try to influence policy? We still don't know the answer to that. But one thing he has done that I think has been positive in everyone's mind is, remember, he went over to Korea and got those American journalists freed. And that was a big advantage. So I often wonder, having covered the White House for so long, isn't there some way we can make use of these ex-presidents more than we do? I mean, they have their own expertises. Maybe we've failed or succeeded, but there's certain things that certain presidents have done well. Now, couldn't the president make some use of them? I know, I actually asked President Ford about this some years ago, and he felt that perhaps there could be some institutional role for the former presidents, but nobody's been able to come up with a real answer for this. So, you know, as longevity increases, we'll probably have more former presidents around for longer periods of time. So it's just an interesting thing what we do with our former presidents. But President Clinton so far has been behaving himself. We'll see how it goes. Now, you know who this is. So we don't hear much about this fellow these days, but this is Vice President Joe Biden, another insider, as Rahm Emanuel and, of course, Hillary Clinton have been. Joe Biden was a senator from Delaware for more than 30 years, and now he's vice president. You know, he doesn't make a lot of public comments. He sort of has a way of embarrassing himself sometimes in his public comments, so perhaps that's one reason why he doesn't do a lot of it. But he has become an inside player trying to move Barack Obama's legislative agenda through the Senate and the House, particularly the Senate, where he knows virtually all the senators. So, but he's another insider. He is one of the voices, by the way, calling for the less is more strategy in Afghanistan. We don't want to occupy the country, says Biden. We want to use this lesser approach of moving our combat troops out, training the Afghanis, and trying to get the bad guys, Taliban and Al-Qaeda, through other means. Now, and it's possible that his arguments are going to have some sway, but we'll know that within a few weeks. But Biden is another sort of consummate insider. And of course, these are the Senate and House Democratic leaders. The Democrats control Congress. So you have Harry Reid of Nevada, who's the Democratic leader in the Senate, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, the first woman to hold that position. An interesting thing that Obama has done, unlike Clinton, who, particularly with health care, presented a bill, almost a final version of a bill, to Congress that was shot down, picked apart, used as a target for many months. What Obama has done is he didn't give Congress a health care bill. He gave them principles and objectives, and he said, Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, you work on the details, and I'll talk to you. We'll have my staff talk to your staff, but it's up to you to get this bill worked out. You work Congress, you make this happen. Now we'll see if it's going to work, because if anything, we have a very complicated and messy situation on our hands in Congress with all these different versions: public option, government role, employer mandate, individual mandate. It goes on, and none of this is resolved. And that's supposed to be happening now in the next couple of months. But he's put a lot of trust, some people think too much deference toward the Democratic leaders of Congress, rather than taking a very aggressive leadership role himself. He keeps promising he's going to do more of that. We'll see if he does that. Now, this is another interesting dimension of the Obama presidency. Presidents don't normally go on late-night television talk shows. They do as candidates, but once they're elected, it's just no president has gone on these late-night shows. Letterman, and this is, of course, Jay Leno. President Obama has done this now, and this has caused a big fuss in Washington. Is this lowering the stature? This is diminishing the presidency by going on these late-night comedy shows. There's a big argument, as I say, does it lower the stature of the presidency? But the Obama argument is that the country gets its information in different ways now than it ever has before. The information access systems are very fractured. The people who might watch his news conferences or watch a speech are not the same people who would watch the late night shows or would get their information from the internet or from bloggers or from radio. So he feels like he has to deal with all of this at the same time. So he does feel that there's nothing wrong with him trying to communicate to these different demographics and these different people in different ways. And that's what he's done here on television. It's interesting, by the way, in the last couple of weeks, something very fundamental has happened with Obama and the popular culture. The late-night comedians and the joke writers of television are starting to poke fun at Obama, which they had not been doing before. Saturday Night Live takes the lead in this, in our culture, in many ways. You might remember Gerald Ford bearing the brunt of this with Chevy Chase, who'd poke fun at Gerald Ford for years. And this has happened over the years. Will Ferrell playing George W. Bush, Dana Carvey playing George Herbert Walker Bush, Darrell Hammond playing Bill Clinton. It goes on and on. Now what's happening is they have this guy named Fred Armisen on Saturday Night Live who is now mocking Obama. He started off 2 weeks ago playing Obama, giving an address to the nation, saying, you know, people are criticizing me, and they're saying I haven't done enough. Well, they have a point, and he goes off a lot of his promises and says at the end of each as the punchline, not done. So it's sort of emerging on the late night and sort of popular culture notion as the do-nothing Obama administration. What else has happened in that time? It's sort of reached critical mass. Well, last Friday, I was home, and about 7 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from a friend of mine in the White House saying, did you know the president won the Nobel Peace Prize? And I thought he was joking. And I thought, well, how could this be? I mean, and he did. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so, I mean, Obama seemed a little bit taken aback by it himself. Because remember, in his comments publicly, he said, well, I really don't deserve this. I've only been here for 9 months. I haven't done enough to deserve it. But I'll accept it as sort of a ratification of where the American people want us to go for international diplomacy and so on. That has also been latched on by the comedy writers of the world. Just last night, again, the late night shows took Obama on about this, joking about how he could have won the Nobel Peace Prize, and that it's sort of a source of he's become the butt of jokes. That may seem like a small thing, but that is an important thing in our culture. When a president gets to the point where people start stereotyping him, making him into a caricature in a negative way, that can really hurt. And we'll see how this turns out with Obama. But something has changed. While these shows were very reluctant to criticize Obama, they're not anymore. So we'll see how that plays out. One thing that I think the Peace Prize issue illustrated, though, is the notion of America's perception around the world. The polls now, there's just some polls out in the last few days indicating that America has now become, and this is just one poll, but some others have supported this notion, has once again become the most admired nation in the world. For many years, for some years under President Bush, it was not that way. Again, I'm not making a value judgment. This is what the polls showed. A lot of people around the world felt that the United States had become too unilateral, too interested in military solutions. Now, I think you have to you attribute a lot of this to Obama and his notion, whether it's good or bad policy. A lot of people around the world feel that he is trying to do things differently, and he's trying to reach out. Now, whether that makes any difference in policy from these other countries, I doubt it. But it's a perception that's sinking in around the world that Obama is willing to reach out. When he goes on foreign trips, he gets a tumultuous reception. This is when he went to Ghana. Now, you'd expect in Ghana, being an African American, he would have a tremendous reception. But he gets this everywhere he goes. Europe, he's going to get this in Asia, from all we know, next month when he goes to Asia. Everywhere. So people really admire Obama and like the idea that he's listening. And so we'll see if this makes any difference in terms of policy, but national interests tend to trump any sort of charisma over the years. But certainly the White House is pleased that he is getting this kind of positive reception around the world. Now, a couple of other quick points. This is sort of an iconic picture of Barack Obama going on Air Force One. He's become one of the most traveled presidents we've ever had. In his first year, the last time I checked, he was actually the most traveled president in going around the world. And he's going to add to those frequent flyer miles, as I say, when he goes to Asia next month on a very extended trip. So he gets back to that notion of vigor and sort of taking the country into places that it had not been before in terms of outreach. But that's another one of the things he's put on his plate, traveling around the world to take his message. And finally, before I take some questions, so what do we have now with President Obama? Well, when I interviewed him, I was struck by how sort of preternaturally confident he is. A man who had relatively little experience for the toughest job in the world doesn't seem to be fazed by all these decisions. He just has a confidence that it'll all work out, that he'll make the right call. At one point during the interview, I gave him the opportunity to talk about where he sort of might get emotional about something. I raised the idea, well, perhaps when you meet the families of troops that have been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. But he's a very dispassionate fellow. And I think that's one thing that some people are troubled by and some people feel comforted by. But he just almost never gets rattled or lets emotion get the better of him. That's one trait. Another is this idea of how he tries to listen to his advisors, and he has surrounded himself with some very smart and talented people. Another trait I wanted to mention is what we've learned about Obama is that he's not reluctant to change his mind. President Bush was criticized a lot for being inflexible. Some people saw that as stubbornness. Some people saw that as commitment to principle and conviction. President Obama, when he told me in my interview with him and said in other venues, that he feels that he thinks circumstances change often repeatedly. So he wants to be ready to be flexible. So what we're faced with now is a president who sees flexibility as a virtue as opposed to staying the course. Now, again, I'll let you decide whether that's good or bad and whether the problems we have today lend themselves more to flexibility or to staying with a decision. But nevertheless, he is very much wedded to the idea that if he has to change his mind, fine. That's just the way things are. And he thinks that he can persuade the country to accept that. Now, that brings me to the final point I wanted to make about him, and that's this persuasiveness. As I said, he's trying to use his communication skills in different ways, in different venues. He does have a lot of charisma, but I think we're at the point now where great speech, great speaking ability is not really what the country wants. I think what the country wants now are results. That's part of why his job approval rating has dropped. It's now stabilized at about 50%. It was up close to 70%. Now, they always drop the president's approval ratings no matter who's elected. But for a while, there was a lot of concern that he was dropping too fast. Now it's stabilized, but I think what the country is signaling here is that their patience is sort of wearing thin, that we're going to have to get this unemployment rate fixed. We're going to have to get a policy in Afghanistan that people can accept. We're going to have to deal with these rogue regimes in North Korea and Iran and their nuclear capabilities. And there's a sense of anxiety that pollsters of Democrats and Republicans have identified. People are just worried that sort of the moorings are coming loose, that something is wrong, that things are out of control in some ways. And the question is whether President Obama can deal with that. And that's the big question that we're going to be dealing with as we move into his second year in office. So with that, I'd be glad to take some questions and talk about whatever you'd like to. Yes?
In your opinion, what do you feel is the level of risk of assassination?
Okay, well, you know, that's sort of a macabre notion, but we do think about that in Washington. You don't see a lot of talk about it. It came up a lot during the town hall meetings over the summer when there was so much anger. There was so much ferocity. And you still get that on the web and among a lot of bloggers, a lot of anger toward Barack Obama, this notion that he's ruining the country. And I know that the Secret Service gets many death threats, and this has been true all through the campaign. They don't like to talk about it. They got many death threats for Obama. His level of security is the strictest I've ever seen. They brought in Secret Service agents from all over the country to take care of him. There are Secret Service agents behind every curtain. I mean, usually this happens, but this has happened in extraordinary degree. I think, God forbid that something would happen, but there's a certain anger and even sense of vengeance among some people. We've always had that strain in our country. We've had a number of presidents who have been assassinated, and God forbid anything like this would happen. But it's something that the Secret Service takes very, very seriously. So, yes, sir.
Along that line, the fact that he's an Afro-American, does that have something to do with it? How much does race account for?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, I'm going to be writing a book about this, so I hope to answer some of those questions. But I think the two thoughts on that. One is that there are, I think, some people who just cannot get used to the idea that an African American is president. It's something that some people just cannot get used to. The second is, on a more positive note, remember President Kennedy during his campaign was feared because he was a Catholic, and he had to address that issue during the campaign. There was a lot of people who were sort of angry, and there was a similar level of ferocity. He was a Catholic. He was going to follow orders from the Pope. We couldn't trust him to put our national security above sort of Catholic dogma. But after he was elected, those concerns almost disappeared because people felt that the problems were too big for that. I mean, now there were still some people who were anti-Catholic and objected to it, but you see very little evidence that it made much of a difference in people's minds in assessing Kennedy. And now maybe that's what's happening with Barack Obama, that our problems are so serious that people see him as a president who happens to be black rather than a black president. He's gone out of his way to portray himself as someone who is trying to solve the problems of the country and does not take a black perspective. Some cases he's veered away from that. When he had that famous incident with the Henry Gates, who was arrested in his home in Massachusetts in that controversial incident, and Obama was asked at a news conference, and he sided with the black professor almost as a knee-jerk reaction. A lot of people were struck by that, but he quickly backed away from that and said he was premature. And so he's really trying his best not to make racial issues something that he's defined by. I was just talking to one of his senior pollsters the other day, and his pollster said that if you look at the public attitudes, people are convinced that he does not make decisions on a racial basis, and that he is what they call individuated. He is an individual in his own right, and being black is just one part of his individuation. Whether that holds up, I don't know, but that's a couple of thoughts on it. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, as you covered the program, have you seems to me like there's used to be disagreement with the president, and now it seems to be just sort of disrespect. It seems like that's been going on for a while.
Yeah, the question is about whether disagreement with presidents has become disrespect. I think that definitely has happened. It's not new with Obama. A lot of people disrespected President Bush, the 43rd president, his predecessor. It goes back to, really with Reagan, where people felt that he wasn't up to the job in a lot of cases, and he was dismissed in a lot of places. But it also goes back to Franklin Roosevelt. Remember, in those days, he was widely hated by a lot of people who, in the phrase of the time, felt he was a traitor to his class, and that he was getting Americans involved in foreign wars, and he was spending money, he was getting the government involved in too many things. So there was a lot of people who disrespected Franklin Roosevelt, too. So this has been part of our history. If you look at our history, there's been sort of things that curl your hair that have been said about presidents almost from the beginning. George Washington was called a traitor by his critics at the time, going way back there. So I don't think this is anything different, but I think what's different now is that these levels of disrespect feed on themselves because not only the mainstream media, where I work, but because of the internet and bloggers and the 24-hour cable stations. Once somebody like Joe Wilson from South Carolina shouts, "You lie," at this address the president made to Congress. Nobody's done that sort of thing before toward the president. But during the pre-Civil War period, one member of the House caned another member of the Senate and almost killed him in the Capitol because of fights over the Civil War, and so over slavery. So we've had this strain in our country for a long time. I think what's happened now, it's been intensified by the media culture we're in. So we're aware of it, and then we can't escape it. Once some incident like this happens, it's everywhere. And so that's sort of my quick thought on that. Yes, sir.
Have you noticed that the president is well liked amongst the congressional senators and representatives compared to Reagan, Bush, Clinton, etc.?
Is President Obama well liked among the congressmen and senators, people in Congress and the senators? I think he's well liked, but he is not the kind of backslapping guy that goes over so well on Capitol Hill. He is a rather diffident guy. He's cerebral. He's not a jokester. He's not a he can be very ingratiating, but I must say that in the first year of his presidency, George Bush, the son, was very popular on Capitol Hill because in person, he's a very engaging, popular guy. Reagan was popular among some people on Capitol Hill, but a lot of people felt that he just, like I said, wasn't up to the job, particularly the liberal Democrats. So I think that Obama does not have a deep level of friendships on Capitol Hill, even for people he served with in Congress. But he has a lot of respect on Capitol Hill. So the question is whether that's going to be enough to get his programs through. So I distinguish between respect and popularity. Yes?
I find when he gets the someone in the talk show circuit, he's on the do you think he's getting too much exposure?
Right. Yeah, is President Obama getting too much exposure? He's everywhere. I think he's approaching that level. I don't think he's there yet. I think that once this health care thing is resolved, then I think he needs to sort of cool it for a while. You can't escape from him on television. He's everywhere. He's giving interviews. He's got radio addresses, press conferences. His radio address on Saturday that Reagan invented is now a video radio address. So it's all over the YouTube. I think we do have a sense in the country that we want to hear from the president, and especially this president. But I think if he looks like he's sort of a celebrity hogging the limelight, if he moves from president and political leader to pure celebrity seeking attention, he's going to have a problem. I don't think he's there yet, but I think it's a problem that he has to be careful about. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, the question is about sort of the terrible calamity we had in the financial markets and with the economy, and if he's doing as much as he should be on that particular issue. You know, this was the first thing on his plate, of course, when he came into office. President Bush had addressed it. Treasury Secretary Paulson had persuaded President Bush that we could be headed for a depression like worse than the 30s if we didn't act quickly, and President Bush accepted that argument. President Obama also accepted the argument, which was presented by Treasury Secretary Geithner and White House Economics Advisor Larry Summers. Now, they have taken enormous steps to deal with this. The question is it enough? And this is a question you get on all these big issues on his plate. Should he have been more involved on the health care issue? Should he have addressed climate change quicker? Should he address the very deep concern people have about energy issues? And I think that raises the broader question, not so much is he overexposed, but is he trying to do too much too soon? And should he set priorities? I mean, what you're raising is a concern you hear a lot, but other people raise that on other issues. And so is he spreading himself too thin? Should he have just focused on the economy? Absolutely, number one, which is basically what Reagan did in 1981. But Obama has taken a different approach. He feels, as he says, that I can do more than one thing at once. Well, can he do 50 things at once? That's the big test. That's the big gamble he's taken. And we'll know more about that by the end of the year, if he can get health care passed and see what he does on Afghanistan, and if he starts to address more publicly the economic, the financial industry. By the way, we also have the immigration issue that's floating out there that a lot of people think he should be focusing on. But I think setting priorities is an important thing to do. And if he can get these basic legislation through on health care and get some kind of a reasonable solution to Afghanistan, I think people will feel the first year was basically a success, and then we'll see if he can address these other issues. But there's a long way to go before he gets those two things done. Yes, in the back. Yeah, I don't know if you heard that. It was basically how the president's schedule, how does he operate day to day, and how is he using the powers of the presidency. I think you're asking, I think, about the expansion of the executive powers. Is that what you're getting at? Well, he during the campaign was a lot more critical about the expanded executive powers. Now that he's president, he can see the value. I mean, presidents often do not give up these executive powers once they have them. They feel that they're the best person to decide, and they don't want to give them up. I know I've interviewed Vice President Cheney about this during the Bush years, and of course he was Jerry Ford's chief of staff, and he said that in those days Congress took a lot of powers from the executive that the executive has taken many years to get back and should get back. So when he was vice president, he pushed and pushed and pushed to get those powers back. War-making powers, covert operations powers, powers to declare secrets, powers to deal with intelligence issues, one thing after another. Now that Barack Obama's in office, he's thinking, well, gee, this isn't such a bad thing to have. And he doesn't have to push for them because they're already there. So, you know, I think that some of his liberal supporters are concerned that he's becoming too interested in keeping these powers, but he is. I mean, so we'll see how that changes, but I doubt it will. I think he likes the idea of having the buttons to push and the levers to pull. As far as his schedule goes, I'm always very accepting of a president's schedule, because the job is so immense that whoever a president decides to deal with it, it's their philosophy of leadership and management. President Reagan was, in many ways, a 9-to-5 president. I mean, he was criticized a lot for that. He'd like to get to the office, you know, not very early in the morning, and then delegated a lot of things, and like to go back to the residence and have dinner with Nancy on television trays in front of the TV. okay, that never bothered me. If it works for him, fine. President Bush was different. He sort of would have sort of a surge theory of management. When he needed to be engaged, he was. When he didn't need to engage, a lot of things, he wasn't interested, frankly. But if he needed to learn about something, he needed to focus on something, President Bush the son did. President Obama is much more intellectually curious, I think, and likes to get into the details of policy, sort of like Bill Clinton did. So his days are very, very busy. He comes to the office about 8 or 8:30 in the morning. He tries to have breakfast with his wife and daughters. I think that's real. I think he does really try to do that. He gets up very early and has a workout every morning. It's interesting how in recent years presidents have become very, very focused on exercise and physical fitness because it helps them clear their minds and clear their heads. Then he has a very busy schedule during the day, and then he leaves the office about 6 or so. Often has social events at night, is very active socially, much more than President Bush, the son, used to be, and then has a lot of things he does in the residence at night, and sometimes into the wee hours. So he's really, he's not quite a workaholic as Richard Nixon used to be, because he does take time out for his family and for personal time, but he is a very hard-working person, and also into the weekends. Now, you know, you see these famous pictures of presidents and how they age. You know, Lincoln and how sort of is a vigorous Lincoln, and then at the end, this ghastly, ghost-like Lincoln. You see it all with all the presidents. It's starting to happen with Obama. His hair is getting gray much quicker than it might have ordinarily. He's starting to look a little bit more haggard, and it's only 9 months into his presidency. So he's a young man. He has a lot of energy, but this job is a real backbreaker, and he's learning that. Yes.
Each president is unique, formed by their background. This is a very unique individual. We can identify with the Midwestern input, but I don't see much writing from you fellows about the qualities that come out of his African experience and background. When you're a chief in Africa, that's something that brings something special to the table that I think I see. And I'd like to see a little more probing of that.
Yeah. Well, the question is Obama's unique background. Should there be more focus on sort of his African roots, the notion of how that shaped him and what that might mean for his ability to conduct the office and how it shaped him as a person? I think that's a good point. I think during the campaign, that's probably one area we should have gotten into more. Now, one thing we have to realize, though, is that his father left the family when he was a toddler. He does not have many roots in Africa that he kept up until quite recently. It's not like his father from Kenya brought him back to his village all the time, and his dad was quite a unique individual in his own right, leaving lots of children in a lot of places, by the way. And Obama, has recognized that, and he had some difficulty coping with being a young African-American man without a father in the home. So we've seen, he's explained this in his books too, by the way, and got into a little bit of the African roots. But I think, to the extent that he's tried to connect with his African roots, it is a story that hasn't been explored very much. Not that he, like I say, ever really lived there or felt it was something that resonated with him, so far as we know, for his early life. But certainly as he's gotten older, as with so many people, in my case, my background is Irish. I wouldn't even care about it until I was about 40 years old. So that happens to a lot of people. So, maybe it came to Obama later in life. But I think it's a good point.
So much to the things that his father did, but I'm referring to the qualities that come from that sort of background. Being a chief in Africa is
Okay, well, being a chief in Africa is a significant thing, our questioner says. I think that's a good point. That might be a good story for me to work on. So, thanks for suggesting it. Yes. Yeah, well, yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think that this is I don't know if you heard the points raised about whether we have gotten to a point where the behavior is gotten so uncivil and even dangerous that how does one teach children the proper standards of respect and civility if we have this kind of problem in the larger culture? I come back to the idea that I think a lot of it is that it's in our faces all the time. I think that a lot of this has always been there, but we didn't have it thrown up at us so much. And you know, if you look at the level of divisiveness in the country, I think you touched on this idea of these commentators. If you hear talk radio, I mean, the left and the right, some of it is really vicious. And now I think you had the question earlier about the possibility of violence. Does it breed that? Well, we hope not, but it certainly is a vicious strain that's out there. But I tend to think that it's been in the country from the beginning. It's just that now it's much more visible to us. It goes viral. It spreads throughout the culture. Now, in your family and in most families, I think people find this appalling. How do you insulate children from it? I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that, but you know, I guess it's sort of protecting them from seeing this sort of thing in the larger culture and in the media, and rewarding them when they resist these kind of behaviors. So I wish I had a better answer, but this is a problem we have in the wider culture. Yes, I guess, do you have one more? Yeah. Yeah, the question is, has the 24-hour news cycle changed policy making and so on since I've been in the White House? Yeah, well, just as an illustration, when I first started covering the White House in 1986, the be-all and end-all of the Reagan presidency were the three broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and their nightly newscasts. They geared everything, pretty much, most everything, to getting their message out on those newscasts every night. They were aiming a line, what they called a line of the day, a message of the day. And Reagan was very good at that. Got into what they call message control, where you say the same thing excuse me, over and over, and you hope the television networks bite, that they take your message and use it. Now, the television, those three broadcast networks have declined in market share. In other words, very much fewer people are watching those broadcasts now. Cable is there. As you say, there's a 24-hour news network, and if anything, it's gotten more intense because not only do we have the cable stations, but we have the bloggers, we have the internet, you have just a constant barrage of information. And I think, now how does it affect policy? Well, it does affect policy in that a White House not only has to be aware of gathering information much more intensely, they have people over there now, their job is to just monitor all the information sources. What is Leno saying? What's on Huffington Post? What is Limbaugh saying? All this sort of thing. So then they have to decide whether to react to it. So I think that the danger is that it leads to momentary decisions designed to affect that 24-hour news cycle and not longer range decisions that might be more sensible or wise. And I think that every one of those presidents, as time has gone on that I've covered, has been aware of this. But haven't really figured out how to deal with it. The main problem I think White Houses have now is resisting the impulse to respond. It's very difficult to let your opponents out there say things about you, or to have what you think of as misperceptions, and there's all kinds of misperceptions from every part of the ideological spectrum being spread. So the White House these days, unlike when I first got to the White House, has to decide when they drink from the fire hydrant and when they don't. There's a constant flow coming out of it all the time of information. When do they engage? When do they not engage? And that's a judgment call. But I think the big question is, do you make decisions based on that 24-hour news cycle, or do you restrain yourself? And I think to his credit, Obama is trying to restrain that with a lot of criticism, like on Afghanistan. You know, according to the 24-hour news cycle, he should have made that decision in the first few hours after McChrystal made his recommendations. Certainly some of his critics said that. So he's been restraining himself. But I know a number of press secretaries and chiefs of staff had told me this, that their big challenge is when to restrain themselves and when to engage. And I think that's the big challenge in dealing with the 24-hour news cycle. So, okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming. Thanks for having me.
It was a wonderful, wonderful program. I was impressed when I heard your remarks in Washington at the awards presentation. But this is quite a different look at the Obama administration from a couple of programs we've had on the first 100 days.
Right.
We're now coming up on the first year. It's our pleasure to present you with a memento from the Ford Library and Museum with a signature of Gerald R.
Great.
Ford, a couple of pens for you. So we hope you will use them in good health and good writing.
It's old technology, but I'll use them well. Thank
That's
you very
great.
much.
Okay, so our new speaker gift has to be an iPod, iTouch, whatever. Only after I get one of those. Before we close, I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of our next two programs, which are issues forums rather than lectures. These are sponsored by the Kettering Foundation, and on October 27th and November 5th, you can come and participate in forums on healthcare issues and also the economy. And to amplify this, this is an example of civic discourse. These are facilitated discussions moderated by professionals, and we've had great success with them. We did 3 of them last fall before the presidential election, and we were able to get more funding from the Kettering Foundation. So we hope you'll consider coming. That's a chance to hear from each other and to explore some possible solutions to some of the very complex issues facing us. These will be followed by a couple of traditional events here at the museum. The traditional tree lighting ceremony is on November 19th and the holiday open house on Sunday, December 6th. These are available on calendars in the lobby. But also in the lobby, we have information about the Friends of Ford, which is the program within the Ford Presidential Foundation, which enables you to support the offering of these programs and the offering of this journalism prize. And in fact, we have a special offer for you this evening. If you join the Friends of Ford tonight, you will be eligible to win a DVD of the documentary about Betty Ford. Betty Ford, The Real Deal is the name of it. And so the man to see is Joe Calvaruso, and you'll have a chance to win that DVD. So now we have a chance for you to meet Mr. Walsh, our speaker, to pick up a copy of his book on presidential retreats, which is quite wonderful and insightful. We have a reception, and also the exhibit upstairs, Picturing the Century, is available for viewing. So thanks so much for coming.